Hello, my name's Irene Beckett. I am the president of the American Coptic Council. And today we have the honor and privilege of meeting with and speaking with Chair Menza from the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, which I will be referring to as USERP for short, for the duration of this meeting. Chair Menza was appointed to serve as the commissioner to the USERF by former President Donald Trump for a second two-year term in May of 2020. She's a policy expert with more than 2 decades of experience in advocating for working families and has been a champion of international religious freedom. She has represented the USERF in delegations to Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Myanmar, Bahrain, Indonesia, Iraq, Azerbaijan, Thailand, Taiwan, and Uzbekistan. And she's traveled on her own personal capacity to Egypt, to Iraq, Jordan, Bangladesh, and spent a month in northeast Syria so she can better understand the persecuted communities in those regions. And I do have to say that actually Egypt and Syria I'm very close with because I'm Egyptian and my husband is Syrian. So
Oh,
I've learned
wow.
all about
So you have a
Syria.
lot going on there.
Yes, Armenian, learned all about that over the past couple of years. So
There's a lot, but you can't be going and understanding from people on the ground. And in the way that the U.S. works a lot of times is, in these countries, you could only go, the people that are working with the U.S. government can only go certain places with certain security. And it just kind of makes it hard for them to just blend in, where I'm able in my own capacity to easily go places and just listen and hear and learn and then report back. And it's been very useful. And certainly I did that I went on an official trip to Egypt and then came right back and did a private one where I could just go meet with people that were off our agenda and just try to listen and understand. And it was definitely helpful because you get a different story and you just get a different feel for what it's really like.
I couldn't agree with you more, and I couldn't applaud you more for actually doing that, especially on your own time. And I know that you're extremely busy, Chair Menza, so I don't want to take up too much of your valuable time, but we do have some questions that we would like your feedback on. And for everybody that's going to be watching this video, these questions were populated based on USERP's report, the 2020 report, which I'm going to provide a link at the end of the presentation. That way everybody could read it.
Wonderful.
So what we did was, as the ACC, we read the report on Egypt, and then we just have some, follow-up questions, if you will.
Great.
And I'll start by saying that Egypt is recommended to be on the State Department's special watch list.
Right.
And we'll start with, names that have popped up a lot on Egypt's, radar, which is Rami Kamel and Mohammed Bashir, who are two humanitarians who have been detained on pre-trial detention for years on absolutely, and I will say, ridiculous charges such as funding terrorist organizations. What is USERP's position on this detainment?
Well, we have spoken out publicly about both cases. And so Mohammed Bashir, at the time of his arrest, was, as you know, the executive director of the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights, or EIPR. And he was detained along with other senior members of that organization, I guess, last fall. And it's important to note that the EIPR is one of the last remaining NGOs in Egypt that has been persistent in reporting on human rights and religious freedom conditions. And so these arrests last November clearly represented retribution for their work generally, more specifically having spoken to a group of EU dignitaries about the dismal state of Egyptian civil society just days before the arrest. And so, following that public awareness campaign on these detentions, and of course, USERP had also spoken out about it, their charges, they were fortunately released, but their charges, including in entanglement, as you said, like with terrorist groups, generally an euphemism for being a part of the Muslim Brotherhood, they still have those charges on the book. So that's definitely, disappointing. Similarly, but unfortunately with less success, Rami Kamel, his arrest and renewal of his unjust pre-trial detention since November 2009. So he was arrested similarly one day before he was expected to travel to Geneva to testify before the United Nations Forum on Minority Affairs. So we have spoken out publicly. We've also privately met with Egyptian officials about this case. And again, like the other case, the idea that somehow he was working with the Muslim Brotherhood makes absolutely no sense with the kind of work that he has done. These are accusations that don't make sense. I think it's important for Egypt to understand that arresting people who might say negative things about them is actually more negative for their reputation than actually anything they could say. So it's really the arresting of these advocates is caused far more damaging PR problems for Egypt than anything they would have said.
What do you think it will take to have these men freed and to have Egypt not do this again?
Right. You know, we're seeing a trend here. First of all, you know, an abuse of pretrial detentions. So that seems to be something that Egypt has continued to do. That isn't a positive development. You know, these ludicrous charges against religious freedom and human rights advocates, um, with this pretrial detention, just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But what it seems that we're seeing is that judges, prosecutors have set themselves up to be these protectors of Egypt's moral and public order at the cost to actual justice. So instead of being prosecutors or judges looking for justice, what they're trying to do is protect, you know, the public order, morality, whatever they want to look at it, and it's not justice. And so we're definitely concerned. This is this trend we've seen, and hopeful that there will be some changes in the way that they're handling these kind of situations.
You know, I think your answer actually is a perfect segue to my next question, which is about the justice system. I'm
Mhm.
an attorney and I work for the Unified Court System in New York.
Okay.
And as such, I firmly believe in the United States judiciary and the court system as a whole. But unfortunately, I can't say the same for the judiciary in Egypt. And does USERF see the judiciary in Egypt as an extension of the will of the government?
You know, I think yes and a no. So I think no, because it's really unlikely that the president, the prime minister, other senior members are telling the judiciary to do these things. But on the other hand, yes, because the judiciary has come, as I mentioned earlier, perceive themselves as these defenders of, you know, morality, the political order, and it's what prosecutors and judges, you know, perceived kind of as a traditional social order. You know, you can look at just a case a couple of weeks ago that TikTok influencers that were charged for, you know, corrupting public morals and trafficking. You know, we know that President Sisi probably had nothing to do with those charges, but yet the system itself has been set up in a way that instead of going for justice, they're doing this public morality approach that's really dangerous. And what we're seeing is a lack of justice. And in the meantime, you have people like Rami Kamel and others who are lingering in this pretrial detention system for well over a year. So we're hopeful that, you know, at some point in time the justice system will focus on justice rather than trying to do be these defenders of morality that isn't effective and is hurting the reputation of the country.
Do you think that, you know, this justice system with defending morality, you know, what's the interplay with the case of the most recent case of Saad Thabit?
Yeah, right. So you think that would make no sense, right? If they really were defending morality, clearly, you know, this is, as most people remember, you know, she was the woman that was stripped naked and taken through the village, and because of a rumor about her son having a relationship with someone, and you know, so here this horrible situation happens, and it's very public, so people can see who the perpetrators are that are taking her through this village up in Minya, you know, and so unfortunately, what we're seeing is this use of instead of using the justice system, we're seeing too many times these customary reconciliation councils, and it's horrifying. As her is a prime example of that. You know, 4 years after this attack in 2016, you know, resulted in the dropping of charges against the defendants, really taking away any chance of justice. But we have seen some positive developments as well. I know that in 2019, I think it was, a police officer who killed a Coptic father and son in Minya was convicted later for that crime through the justice system. And that would have been unfathomable 15 or 20 years ago. So we are seeing the justice system used more often than in previous years, but too often these reconciliation sessions are problematic.
And it's actually, I think in USERF's recommendation to the US government was to phase out these customary reconciliation councils.
Right.
You know, what did USERF see or investigate that led to this recommendation?
Yeah, so we have long recommended that the US government consistently and boldly press the Egyptian government. You know, so the US government really needs to push the Egyptian government to stop these longstanding practices of ceding legal authority to customary reconciliation councils. So, you know, we say long term, but it's really, you know, someone had said to me in Egypt, oh, this is historic for us, and It's like, no, this is a country with thousands of years of documented history. This has only been a couple of decades of customary reconciliation councils. So this isn't like that. This is part of the culture here. This is a way that they set up that really is allowed these egregious attacks on sectarian attacks to go with impunity. So in Coptic victims know they have no hope. So why would they even turn in, go for the justice system if this is going to be how it's going to work? I don't know if people understand how it works, but really the way that these customary reconciliation councils would work is usually following like a rumor involving some perceived attack or slight, like something on social media or something someone said. A mob, like a local imam, will whip up a mob that will attack Christian homes, businesses, sometimes people themselves. Sometimes they'll set them on fire or just other kinds of attacks. The police typically stand back while the violence takes place, only stepping in when the attacks subside, and then they arrest the perpetrators and the victims. And this is where it gets so complicated for us. So when these reconciliation councils convene, the local religious leaders and family members agree to stop attacking each other and provide the accused, so both sides kind of make, they both give in a little bit. So the one, okay, I won't attack anymore. And then the victim has to give too. And sometimes the give is even leave the village. And so oftentimes the very people that were the victims of the crime are actually victims again during the reconciliation session. So, this is why these are so problematic, and why they need to stop and use the justice system instead, because the justice system would be a deterrent to these kind of crimes.
Okay. I feel as not so much as an outsider because I was born in Egypt, but when I hear about these reconciliation tactics, it's as if Egypt is trying to give this false sense of we're taking care of it, these villages, we're taking care of the situation, we're trying to solve it, when in actuality, it's not helping the victim. The victim is being arrested. The victim sometimes has to leave. And so there's really no positive outcome for us. So I do, I personally understand and agree with why the commission would try to, stop this in its entirety.
Right. And there's no doubt that perhaps the reason that they were started was because they thought getting disputes over quickly, quietly, easily, without having a big, long term, like a trial can take a while and get a lot of press and maybe rise up, sectarian division. And so the thought was, oh, we'll just get it over really quickly, put it quickly behind us, and then move on with our lives. But it doesn't actually work that way, because then there's no deterrent to these crimes. There's no justice for the victim, and there's no deterrent for those that want to attack. Most of the time, Christians and many in other places, but other minorities, there's really no deterrent. And so, while some people may have meant for them to be helpful, they've turned out to be really harmful on so many different levels.
Okay, great. Our next question kind of focuses now on the financial relationship between the United States and Egypt.
Okay.
The United States gives Egypt aid in the amount of $1.3 billion annually. With Egypt receiving this much aid from the United States, does USCIRF support the idea of having the aid somehow tied to Egypt being a little bit more proactive in instituting policies that would eliminate religious intolerance, which are unfortunately part of the government, part of just daily life? Perhaps having it tied to minorities rising to positions of power in Egypt throughout all different areas.
And USCIRF generally supports the concept of tying USAID to Egypt to progress in improving religious freedom and human rights conditions. We've in the past made several recommendations like that. However, unfortunately, the reality is only a fraction of that 1.3 billion you mentioned is really ever up for debate. The relationship with the U.S. and Egypt is the security relationship is so strong. So it's being a really small amount of money. But nevertheless, if they could make that even like a 300 million conditional on human rights progress, that would be something. So, we would, current recommendations, they really are twofold. So first, we've called for the U.S. to explicitly dedicate a portion of their assistance, hopefully not that was going to military, to promoting religious tolerance and inclusivity. And part of that, I think, is improving teacher training. I know they've done some wonderful work with curriculum, working with the government to further some of those positive things they're already doing. And I think the other one is, we call for a requirement that a national security waiver right now is often issued that shouldn't be. So really, the U.S. government has often just looked away at the human rights conditions, religious freedom, and so what we would like them to do is to justify that waiver and explain how they have interacted with the Egyptian government, talking about human rights and religious freedom. So that's all been very transparent.
And that actually, that's my, my next question is the idea of transparency
Yeah.
between the United States and the aid that's actually given to Egypt, and trying to have it just be publicly put out there so people know, whether they're in Egypt or whether in the United States, how the money is being used, what's actually happening. And so it would be USCIRF's recommendation to have more transparency with the aid.
Absolutely. And there's so many concerns in the human rights community and religious freedom with these conditions. And so just having the U.S. government be very transparent in how they're funding the Egyptian government, how the money is going for, and having them tied to these benchmarks, it would really be a win-win, because clearly, as you see some of these conditions in Egypt, having an incentive to change, inertia is hard. We see this all the time in our own government. Change is hard, and having somehow a reason to push change, even if people have the best intentions. Of course, we've talked often in our reports about how President Sisi has said a lot of really affectionate things towards Christians, and it seems to show real support. But getting legal changes and pushing towards actual structural change, we just haven't seen those. And so, the U.S. government is sitting in a perfect position to be able to incentivize some change, and certainly with this funding and being very transparent about it would be a strong step forward.
And I do agree with you. And I often hear this from my parents, how, leadership under President Sisi has been better in general for Christians. But with that being said, I do feel that there's still a long way to go. Yes, he attends mass. Yes, he's made affectionate comments, but it's more than just those words. It's just more than those actions. There has to be institutional change, which does take time, but at least we can make that start. Let's start taking that first step.
Right. So he said some really important things, like all should be able to believe or not to believe. He said everyone should have a church in Egypt, every religion. We've still not seen that. We're only seeing, the Abrahamic faiths having places to worship. So some of the things he said, we'd love to see some follow through on, and certainly our recommendations are very specific with legal changes and things like the blasphemy. We have seen that blasphemy used so frequently against non-Muslim communities in Egypt, in one of the highest rates in the world. And so these are things, there's so many different things legally that could be done that would move Egypt towards religious freedom, and also help even with the culture and tolerance, and in encouraging those things that USCIRF, it makes very clear that we believe that there's a way forward, and we really have laid out some of those steps.
Absolutely, definitely. Does the definition of persecution in Egypt apply to the persecution of all the minorities named in the USCIRF report, including the Coptic community?
Yeah, it still does apply to the Coptic community, but with a few caveats. First, USCIRF maintains 3 criteria for all the countries, and this is our report that I'd encourage. I know you said you do a link for that, so I appreciate that. So this is our annual report, and we go through countries that we recommend being a country of particular concern or a special watch list country. So to become a country that we recommend qualify as a country of particular concern, needs to have religious freedom violations that are systematic, ongoing, and egregious. And if a country meets only 2 of those, then we'd recommend them as a country of a special watch list country, which is what we've done for Egypt. We continue to recommend them. Egypt, as I mentioned, has a serious problem with sectarian discrimination and violence, and it maintains a legal framework that restricts religious freedom, such as vague and heavily enforced the blasphemy laws. But we're not seeing it's the sort of egregious sorts of violations that we'll often see, in the more, we have recommended countries like Burma, China, Saudi Arabia, even India, Eritrea has countries of particular concern. So we're not seeing the same sort of egregious violations that we're seeing in those countries, but we are seeing severe violations. And so, Egypt has shown some improvement and some change, modest and ever so slow, but we have seen a marked. And so, when you look back during the Mubarak presidency, you saw more in some respects discrimination challenges for non-Muslims. So we're seeing some positive things that have occurred slowly, but clearly there still is persecution, as we've seen against particularly the Coptic in mainly in some of these areas like Minya. But we, like I said, appreciate the president, as you mentioned, going to the Coptic Mass and presiding over the opening of the Cathedral of the Nativity in 2019, which I was able to attend myself. And it was a really special moment to be able to see the president, with thousands of Coptic Christians celebrating Christmas. So, I know they have a long-term way to go in order to have an even playing field for all religions. Coptic Christians as well as other smaller areas, but I think that it's definitely possible. It's just we need to see this, really encourage the U.S. government to press the Egyptian government to make some of these changes that can help move them towards more religious freedom.
I couldn't agree with you more. And it's actually, the goal of the American Coptic Council is to try to involve our community here in the United States, to push our representatives to do these things and to be more aware. I often say, and I came to the US when I was 7 years old, and I think my friends would not know anything about what's happening in Egypt, any of the atrocities that happen. And so that's why it's important to have these conversations, to have our constituents here in the United States call up our representatives and say, take a look at this report. Now, this is a commission of the United States government. Look at what they found. Look at what they wrote about. Look at their investigation and use that to tie that into it, recommend or strongly incentivize Egypt to kind of get these things done, not only in Egypt, but, freedom throughout the world. Because I think one of the basic human rights is to just be able to worship as you please without having, fear of retribution or anything like that.
Exactly. And that's really, we try to judge all these countries by an international standard. So we're not comparing them to the United States. We're not using, the US Constitution. It's really the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and really that international standard for things like, for instance, the approval of church buildings. Clearly, it's been a difficult road for that in Egypt, and it hasn't met the international standard. The church building law of 2016, just kind of shows how difficult it is. It's been very slow to implement since its passage. I believe, the cabinet has only approved about 1,800 of the 5,200 churches and church-related buildings. And while Egyptian bureaucracy is famously slow, that's slow. I know that the president has ordered for all new neighborhoods to have a place of worship for both Muslims and Christians. And again, that's such a powerful statement for the president to make, but we haven't seen that actually happening. We've seen there's far, far more. I think there's, I read 250% more mosques than churches per capita. So, we're not seeing that happen. And we're waiting, the churches registration, when we're talking about these registrations, these are all churches that have already been built. So they're not even new churches. They're supposed to be able to stay open while they apply, but we've seen mob violence close some of them. And if word gets out that they've applied, we've seen negative happens, especially of course in Minya in those areas. And so, it just shows you that how it gets down to the rubber meets the road with some of these specific recommendations. I also wanted to list that some of our recommendations, we talked about some of them, like the reconciliation sessions, and of course, approving the houses of worship, but also to repeal decrees banning Baha'is and Jehovah's Witnesses and remove religion from the identity documents, because clearly, that is causing discrimination against Coptic Christians and other religious minorities when the minute they show someone their card, they're immediately identified as being different. We see all sorts of Article 53 of the Egypt Constitution, pass laws that are consistent with that, because they do have some good language in their constitution that they need to follow when it comes to religious freedom. And another one that's, I think, really important is repealing Article 98F of the Criminal Code, which is really what we call the blasphemy code. And we've brought up these specific recommendations with members of the Egyptian government. And there's always been a sense that, we have to move slowly. It's hard, but yet, in my time with USHRF in 3 years, I have not seen any of these changes. So, although I appreciate the language, I appreciate some of the positive changes. It would be wonderful to see the government embrace a few of these recommendations to say, oh, we can do away with the banning, and that I believe is like 40 years old. They could easily, the president by executive order could eliminate the ban on Jehovah's Witnesses and Baha'is. And so, there are lots of things they could do. They could change this blasphemy code so it's not quite as harsh and it isn't used so often against people that clearly have nothing. If there's a rumor that somebody has said something or done something, oftentimes this law is used against them. So it's really used more as a weapon against religious minorities than it is to keep any sort of peace, is where a lot of the people that support them say that's why they have them, but that's not the use of these laws. So there really are a lot of ways forward for Egypt that wouldn't be that heavy of a lift, that would show the international community that they're serious about wanting to meet these international standards, and they want to create a culture where all religious communities can live peacefully together and practice their own faith. So I hope we get USCIRF will be able to visit officially at some point in the near future. I know we've been planning to meet with the ambassador, looking forward to doing that soon as well with the new ambassador, and hoping we can continue to dialogue with Egypt. It's such a spectacular country. And we at USCIRF, I've explained to them on numerous occasions that, at USCIRF, when we sit around talking about Egypt, we do so in the most, with so much admiration, and really affectionately so. I think we all have strong positive feelings towards Egypt and really want to see Egypt succeed. And some of these laws are actually adding to this conflict that's actually impacting the economy and having this really negative effect on the entire country. So it's the things that I feel like we're recommending is a win-win for Egypt, because it will help bring a more stable, a more peaceful, help economically, and just make a better quality of life for the people of Egypt.
I couldn't agree with you more, and I really don't even have anything else to add because you just said it so perfectly.
Thank you.
It would be a win-win for Egypt by
Exactly.
as they had the parade of pharaohs and they had so much public
So spectacular.
beautiful, absolutely
Yeah, really was.
phenomenal. Now do the same thing for the people now that are living there, that want to live in peace, that want to do all these things. And if they were to start to make these changes, word would spread, and
Mhm.
it would also, I think it would have a tremendous economic benefit for Egypt as well. And we do all want to see it succeed. Egyptians here, the Coptic community here in Egypt, all across the world, really, that's where my roots are from. That's where my parents are from. I still have family there, and we all want to see Egypt succeed, but we do want to see Egypt taking those necessary steps to make change happen. They can't just say it's going to be slowly. You have to take proactive
Right.
steps.
There needs to be some change. All right. I agree with you, but I'm so glad to have this conversation. And I think the more we talk about it, the more we talk with members of Congress, the more these are communicated in this kind of framing, will be more helpful for people in the U.S. government to understand, what's at stake and how the U.S. government will be a better friend really to Egypt.
Absolutely. Chair Menza, thank you so much for your time. Really greatly appreciated. We look forward to working with you in the future and to continue these conversations. So thank you again.
Well, thanks so much for having me, and we really appreciate your work, and we look forward to continuing to work together.
Absolutely.